Steve Young again. It's March 2025. It's 50 years since the fall of South Vietnam and Saigon. It's a long time, which means there are a lot of people who may be watching these videos who didn't live through the history. And so they've got a question. Young Vietnamese Americans, other Americans, why the Vietnam War? What happened? Why did it go on so long? Why were so many people killed and hurt and wounded? Well, it's a complicated story. But to understand it, we have to understand two things. We have to understand first who the Vietnamese were as a people long before the Vietnamese War started. And I'm talking about the Vietnamese War, which started in late 45, really 1946. But for centuries before that, the Vietnamese were a people with a long history. So I want to talk a little bit about, to give you the basic periods and the important highlights of Vietnamese history. The second thing is that communism came from the West. It came from the French. It did not come from Vietnam. So you can think of the Vietnam War as a contest between Vietnamese-ness and a Western ideology, communism, which the famous books were written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. They were not Vietnamese. Ho Chi Minh and the other Vietnamese communist leaders learned their communism from the French. They didn't learn it in Vietnam. So there's a kind of neo-colonial aspect to communism in Vietnam. So the people on one side, they're rejecting what comes from the French and the West and the colonial thing. But the people on the sort of the Western side, communists in particular, they know how to organize. They're very skilled and disciplined, and they're ruthless. So that, in a nutshell, is why there was a Vietnam War. And the question you might ask, or you have, and we'll get to it, is, so why did the communists win? So let me go back to the Vietnamese. Now, the Vietnamese history begins, well, the Vietnamese like to say they have 4,000 years of history, which is probably more or less true, which means the origin of the Viet people is maybe 2000 BC, somewhere in there. And we know a couple of things. We know, for example, that before like 200 BC, all the people living in China and what is now North Vietnam, along the coast, from the Yangtze River down into today's North Vietnam, were called Viet. They were Viet peoples. It's called, and the Chinese called them the Baiuet, Vietnamese, the Bat Viets. They were they were tribal people. They spoke a Vietnamese language, which is very similar. Now, then what happened is as the Han people, the Chinese people, the Han people north of the Yangtze River, as they in about 200 BC organized an empire, a big empire, they brought all the Han people together under one man who took the title of emperor. Quang Di in Chinese, Quang Bei in Vietnamese. He then sent his army south, and they conquered all the Viet people, including ultimately the Viets who lived in the Red River Valley in today's North Vietnam. Over many centuries, the Viets were then, they became Chinese. They learned the Chinese language, and they assimilated into China. Now, the small group of Viets who lived in Vietnam never really assimilated. They lived under the Chinese for 1,000 years, but they did not become Chinese. They kept their own language and their own culture, and they rebelled. Now, they also have memories of famous kings, the Hombang dynasty of kings, and Vietnamese who fought back against the Chinese, like the two Trung sisters. But what we also have found in Vietnam are bronze drums, great big round bronze drums with a flat top, and they're like this big, some of them, and other bronze artifacts. These bronze artifacts were made by the ancestors of today's Vietnamese. They were Viet people who made bronze instruments at the same time the Chinese had bronze. So to some extent, the Vietnamese had a culture which was equally sophisticated to the Chinese. But they never got the trick of organizing great big armies until later. So what happens is under the Han dynasty, a a Chinese warlord who called his state Nam Viet, Southern Viet. He subordinated himself to the Han Empire. That brought along the Vietnamese who lived in what is now North Vietnam. The Chinese, therefore, began to appoint governor generals to administer these people and introduce Chinese language and Chinese culture. In 39 AD, two sisters, started a rebellion against the Chinese. And they said, we're Vietnamese. We don't want to be dominated by the Chinese. And they were successful for a couple of years. But then the Chinese organized a bigger and better army under General Ma Vien. He comes into Vietnam. He defeats the Trung sisters. And at this point, something interesting happens, which is going to influence the Vietnamese history until the present time, 2,000 years. The Chinese then bring in the Chinese ritual for marriage, which is different from the ancient Vietnamese ritual for marriage. In the ancient Vietnamese ritual for marriage, or the family structure, according to my teacher, Professor Wee, it was the son-in-law who married into the wife, the girl's family. The Chinese system was the alternate. In the Chinese system, the girl would leave her family and join the family of her husband in order to take care of the ancestor worship and other things of the husband's family, and we call patrilineage. The Vietnamese system was a son-in-law system, which you could call matrifocal, perhaps matrilineal, but I don't think so. But in any case, it was a very different family dynamic. So, is it a coincidence that the first two Vietnamese who stood up to fight the Chinese were women? And they were saying something about our people, our values. But the Chinese ended up ruling Vietnam for about 1,000 years. But it was kind of it wasn't a thorough process of turning Vietnamese into Chinese. And the Vietnamese had several, I think 3 or 4 times, there were major revolts against the Chinese. So clearly the Vietnamese are protecting something that's very important to them. Their own language. Now they've learned the Chinese language. They're starting, the elite will write in Chinese characters. The Vietnamese language was they never developed their own alphabet back then. But something else happened later on. So anyway, the Chinese dynasty, it was the Tang dynasty, a Buddhist dynasty, very cultured, very strong. But like all Chinese dynasties, it gets to a high point, and then it gets weaker, and then it collapses. When the Tang dynasty collapses, the Vietnamese see an opportunity to revolt and get independence. So another Vietnamese leader, Ngo Quyen, he organizes an army. He defeats the Chinese. They pull back into China, and Vietnam becomes an independent state without much of a government, and more like chiefs and regional influential individuals with their own prestige. For a period, there were like 12 kings competing with each other. So now to the north in China after that, the Sung dynasty arises. So the Sung dynasty also then becomes powerful in all of China, and they decide that they need to take back this little province of where the Vietnamese are living. So they send an army down, and they cooperate with another people called the Cham, who live to the south of the Vietnamese in what is now central Vietnam. The Cham people were a Malayo-Austronesian. They were influenced by Hinduism. They built Hindu temples. The influence from India had come around as it did into what is now Indonesia, into Java, into Cambodia. But there was a Vietnamese, the dynasty was called the Le dynasty. One of the princes of the Le dynasty, a general named Le Tung Kiet, he, with a smaller force, I think, had a major victory over the Sung Chinese. And so they gave up. And Le Tung Kiet had a famous saying, which he used to inspire his troops, talking about the rivers and mountains of the south, meaning not in China. And what he said, using the theory of yin and yang and geomancy, which the Chinese sort of knew about, but it was never as important to the Chinese as it was to the Vietnamese. So Le Tung Kiet says, in the south, there are rivers and mountains given by heaven. And living in the south was a day, an emperor figure. The south could have a day, just like the north could have a day. So you had the Bac day, the northern day, and the Nam day, the southern day. what he was saying, and the Vietnamese until this day, I think they believe it in their souls, in their hearts, is that we have a right to an independent country. We have a right to go directly to heaven through our own day. We don't have to go ask the Chinese to go petition heaven on our behalf. So the Li dynasty establishes an independent country. But again, as most dynasties, it gets started, it gets strong, and then it gets weaker. It was followed by the Trung dynasty, a different family. And the Trung founder was a pretty tough guy, Trung Tudou, not very nice to the Li. He killed off a lot of the Li men to make sure they wouldn't sort of rise and revolt against the Trung. But then the Sung dynasty in China is collapsing, and the Mongols take over China. So the Mongol dynasty in China, called the Yuan dynasty, they invade Vietnam 3 times, and they're beaten. These are the Mongols. I mean, Chinese Mongols, but the Mongols both in China and elsewhere, Genghis Khan. I mean, the Mongol armies, they go into the Middle East, they go into Europe, they're defeated at the gates of Vienna. If I think the Poles had not come down to fight them in Vienna, they would have conquered Europe. And the Western civilization we have today, who knows what would have happened. Anyway, the Vietnamese beat the Mongols 3 times with the great general, Trung Lung Bao. The Trung dynasty was also a Buddhist dynasty, and many of the Trung kings would write poetry. So you can read the poetry. You can go directly to the thinking and the spirit of these Trung kings in the 1300s, 1200s and 1300s. Now, so the Trung, again, they get weak, and at the end of the Trung, there's a guy who's studied, he's not so Buddhist, his name is Ho Kui Li, and he studied more Chinese Confucianism, and he wants to become emperor, so he overthrows the Trung dynasty and sets himself up as the king of Vietnam, but nobody follows him. Then one of the descendants of the Trung family, they petition the new Chinese dynasty, the Ming dynasty, to restore them to the throne. Because previously the Trung had asked the Ming to recognize them. Now the Vietnamese played sort of a, what should I say? They made a distinction. They recognized that the Chinese emperor was the Dey, and they did not ask to have the title Nam Dey. They accepted a lower title of Vuong. And the Chinese didn't even like to use the name. They didn't want to call them the Viets. They called it An Nam, the pacified South. So the Chinese would send up a piece of paper down with fancy seal from the emperor in Beijing, or other cities when they were there, saying, I confirm you as the An Nam Quoc Vuong, the king of the nation or the state of pacified South. And the Vietnamese would say, thank you very much. Inside Vietnam, the king called himself a Dey. It would be and they used the name Dai Viet for their country. They knew they were Vietnamese. They knew they weren't Chinese. So the Trung sent a petition up to Beijing saying, look, this guy Ho Kui Li has come along. He's overthrown our dynasty. Please send the Chinese army down to help. So the Chinese said, sure. So they used this as an excuse to conquer Vietnam. And at about 1400. So then there was another Vietnamese guy who lived more to the south named Le Lai, and a Mandarin, a guy who was a brilliant poet and writer and thinker named Nguyen Trai. So they formed a team. Le Lai was the general. Nguyen Trai was the strategist. And it took them some 20 years, and they mobilized the Vietnamese people, and they finally defeated the Ming. And they drove the Ming out of Vietnam. And they founded the Le dynasty. Now, what's particularly important about the Le dynasty, I think, is that they came up with their own law code. They did not copy the Chinese Ming law code. So here's another evidence that the Vietnamese had their own way of thinking about what's right and wrong with culture, society, and politics. And in this Le law code, they gave women, mothers and daughters, more power, more legal power and social power than Chinese women had. So it was very different. Now, another thing where the Vietnamese kept themselves different from the Chinese was they believe in, how should we say this, sort of divine, in the spiritual realm, divine personages, great generals, great leaders, great people with talent, with skill, who pass away, but their presence can still be felt. It's sort of a version of this is ancestor worship. Your grandfather may have passed away, but somehow his spirit, his influence is still there. So you pray to your grandfather to help you. Every village would have a shrine. This is a book about all the shrines in various villages. And they would pick dedicated people, virtuous people, locally heroic people, an excellent farmer, a marvelous husband, a wonderful wife. And they would have a little altar to these people because their spirits were still around. So the Vietnamese live not only with this sense of yin and yang, they live with a sense of people who are outstanding. They are given a sense of security by outstanding people. And this is very different from being Chinese. So the Lei dynasty has this law code. But again, the Lei dynasty goes into this pattern of it climbs up to power and then it starts to decline. A turning point comes for the Lei about 1500. And what happens there is the Lei king, Lei Tentong, he begins to bring in law from China. These are his decrees, the Hom Duk Tin Chin Tu. He doesn't come up with a new law code, but he starts bringing in decrees about family organization, village organization, which follow Confucian teachings based on the Ming. And there's a particular school of Confucianism called Neo-Confucianism, which the Ming used. So as the 1500s go into the 1600s, the Lei ruling family gets weaker and weaker. There's another family called the Mac. They kind of want to take over. So they take over and they make an alliance with the Chinese. But the Mac are defeated. Then there are two other families. There's a Trin family and a Nguyen family. The Trin family gets power like in Japan, the concept is the shogun, right? There was the imperial family, but then there was the Tokugawa. The Tokugawa did not take the title of king. They took the title of like senior advisor, shogun. But they had the power in Japan. In Vietnam, in the northern part, the Trin family took over the real power. There was still a Lei emperor who had the different ministries, but the Trin family had next to each ministry an advisory board. So the Trin family could tell its people in the advisory board to tell the ministry what to do, whether it was the Ministry of Rights or the Ministry of Education or rituals, et cetera, et cetera. In the southern part of Vietnam, where the Cham people used to live, a Vietnamese family called the Nguyen, they were like the shogunate in a separate part, the southern part of Vietnam. And they started conquering the Cham, and they began pushing the Vietnamese south. And by the time we get to 1800, the Vietnamese people have moved all the way down to the Mekong Delta. The two families, the Trin and the Nguyen, they fight each other. But it's sort of a stalemate. The Nguyen never really go to try to overthrow the Trin. The Trin try to invade the Nguyen domain a little bit, but they're defeated. It's a sort of status quo between the balance of power. But the Trin family in particular, they continue the process of bringing Chinese kinds of rules and regulations to Vietnam. So what's happening in the 1600s and the 1700s is that the Vietnamese, particularly in the north, are developing a new social class. It's kind of an aristocracy. It's a landlord class. Many of the sons go to work for the government, but the key, a distinctive factor of the class is the study of the Confucian text, study of Neo-Confucianism. And I can't remember the year, 1720, maybe something like that. The Trin family comes up with an order copied from the Ming Chinese that I think once a week or once a month, every village chief has to gather the villagers together and read a list and ethical code of good Confucian behavior for the Vietnamese. So this Vietnamese elite of wealthy families tied to the government is becoming more and more important. But this elite is estranged from the Vietnamese tradition of believing in local spirits and in Buddhism. In the early 1700s, a guy, Phan Huy Chu, he writes a documentary history. He finds all kinds of documents, and he writes in several, I think there are 4 volumes that he wrote, which is he's recording all the documents of the court and things like that. And in here, he's got one document where some Vietnamese writes that they don't like the local district officials because they're very arrogant and they're very bossy. And the quote is, they look down on the Vietnamese people as the Chinese look down on the Vietnamese people. So here's evidence of some perception in the 18th century that Vietnam now has an elite which is kind of foreign, which is looking towards a different culture, a Chinese culture. Now, what happens in the South, where the Nguyen family is there's a revolt, because the Nguyen family is kind of like a warlord family. They have their supporters, the people they take care of, and then there's everybody else. There's another family, also with the family named Nguyen, but they go under the title of the Tay Sung. There's several brothers who rise up in revolt. They fight against the Nguyen. They defeat the Nguyen, and then they turn north to basically try to unify Vietnam, and that they would become the new king or the Nam Day, the emperor of the South. The particular brother who was dynamic and heroic, very charismatic, a good general, was called Nguyen Huai. But the interesting thing about Nguyen Huai is he used this new kind of writing for the Vietnamese language, which was called Nom. And Nom was invented, I think, in the start of the 1300s in the Trung Dynasty. But they used Nom to preserve the Vietnamese, because the vocabulary of the Vietnamese is different and the grammar is different. Now, I have to admit, Vietnamese language has a lot of loan words from Chinese, because the Chinese ruled for 1,000 years, and they read a lot of Chinese books and things like that. But Vietnamese grammar is still different. The word order, noun, adjective, or adjective, noun, right? So what the Vietnamese did, by the way, the Koreans did something similar. The Korean written language was designed so that you could write the Korean language. The Vietnamese didn't create a new script. What they would use, as I understand, is they would use 2 Chinese characters for one Vietnamese word. So one Chinese character had the meaning of the word. The second Chinese character in Chinese was pronounced very similar to the Vietnamese pronunciation. So if you're a Vietnamese reading a text in Nom, you see the 2 characters like this, and your mind works fast, and you say, oh, it's this meaning. Let's say black. The meaning is black, and the sound is given as a sound that sounds kind of like black in Vietnamese, dang. So you look at these 2 things, and you say, oh, dang, and your mind is fast, and that's how you do it. Now, there was a particular Vietnamese, how would you call him? La Sang Phuta, who is his pen name. He was a master of the arts of yin and yang, and the future, and astrology, the turning of each year, the dragon year, the snake year, things like that. And he was intellectual, and he had I hate to use the word visions, but he could sort of see beyond everything that's right in front of us. He was a great thinker. Maybe I should put it that way. So he was consulted by Nguyen Huai. Nguyen Huai looked up to him as a teacher and as an inspiration and as an intellectual guide. Last time he lived in a small village near a mountain somewhere. Nguyen Huai didn't follow the Ming classics. He didn't follow Zhu Xi from the Sung Dynasty, right? He followed this Vietnamese guy, which becomes very important because as Nguyen Huai and the Tay Sung are moving to the north against the Trinh, the Lê dynasty, who's the figurehead, they asked the Chinese to come help them, because the Lê had been, every time there was a new Lê king, they would petition the Chinese court for investiture of the Annam Quoc Vuong or something like that. And the Chinese, this time it's the Qing dynasty, they say, fine, we'll send an army in. So they send an army into what is now Hanoi to protect the Lei dynasty. And Wing Wei goes to La Sanfutu to ask for a prediction. We use the word fortune telling, which is, to me, is sort of like, makes it sound sort of silly, superficial, and not important. But for the Vietnamese, it's like there's a skill here. There's a science. You can know how yin and yang is moving. And so La Sanfutu said that because of the year, the Lunar New Year, he said, if you're going to do it, you got to go fast, because you only have a certain amount of time in which your power is going to be better than the Chinese power. So Wing Wei rushes up to Hanoi, and there's a big battle outside of Hanoi, and the Vietnamese win, because they did it within the context of Vietnamese thinking. Now, sadly, I suppose, I do feel sadly, Wing Wei dies young. And he leaves a young son who's not old enough to become king, and his own family starts sort of fighting about who's going to do this. The other Wing family I talked about, they have one of their descendants. He's fled to Thailand. And so in the late 1700s, he gets some help from the Thais. They help him with an army. He comes back to the southern part of Vietnam, Mekong Delta. He raises his own army. He brings people to him, and he ultimately conquers and defeats the Tay Sung. He then, in 1802, sets himself up as a new king, as a new emperor, which he calls himself an emperor in Vietnam. And he then brings into Vietnam the Chinese law code. Word for word, he brings the Qing dynasty law code into Vietnam. Now, all of a sudden, the Vietnamese are being ruled by the Chinese language, by Chinese provisions. The power of women is not put in here. And there's also an implicit statement as, where do you look for authority? And Jialong, it was the name of the first king, Jialong, in his preface to this law code, says, the Qing Dynasty Law Code is the most sophisticated, the most brilliant code of laws that humanity has ever written up. Therefore, we Vietnamese have to recognize that superiority, and we have to follow it. But down in the village level, the phrase was "Phép vua tua lei lan." The village customs didn't change. The village customs still followed people like La Sanfutu, who would read your face for the yin and yang of your face. They do geomancy. They would predict fortunes depending on the calendar. They would use the I Ching, and they continued the tradition at the village level of paying attention to local divine spirits or spirits who could transcend time and still have their presence, not Chinese at all. So what's going to happen is the French are going to arrive in the 1850s. And what they're going to find is Vietnam or Vietnamese people divided between an elite based on the Nguyen dynasty ruling in the city called Hue, which is very Chinese, is very Sinified. They write one of the kings, Tu Duc, he writes his poetry in Chinese characters. The court of the Nguyen dynasty, they don't use the Nom written script. They go to the Han Chinese characters. So the Vietnamese elite has to learn Chinese. At the same time, at the village level, there's a different culture. And the traditions of the Vietnamese people, their soul, if you will, their poetry, if you will, is at the level of the village. So the next phase in Vietnamese history is, how do the Vietnamese respond to the French? And we'll talk about that in another video.